the second MCLS special of December. And this is focused on effective strategies for responding to reviewers during the revision process in scientific journals. It will be a panel discussion involving 4 accomplished academics with significant experience as journal editors, who I'm sure can offer valuable insights and advice about what the editors and reviewers expect from the authors when they write response letter to reviewers. So we are very happy to have Colin Ganley, Camilla Gilmore, Andre Knops, and Bert de Smet in this panel. I hope this will be a great discussion. Maybe we can start, you can start by introduce yourself, maybe say a couple of words about yourself and your editorial experience. And then we can start with some questions that we received in the Google form that we sent out some days ago. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to start. So I'm Bert de Smet. I'm a professor at University of Leuven in Belgium. I've spent quite some time in the field of mathematical cognition, I guess more than 20 years. In terms of I'm just focusing on my editorial experience. So I'm currently an associate editor for developmental science and for Psychologica Belgica, which is a local, well, it's an international but mostly local journal. I've been an editor for the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology, and in editorial boards of Journal of I'm currently in the editorial board of Journal of Educational Psychology. So yeah, that's the editorial work, and I've reviewed, apart from that editorial work, for a lot of journals in a very broad areas, from education to psychology to neuroscience.
Okay, shall I go next? Camilla Gilmore, I'm professor at Loughborough University in the Centre for Mathematical Cognition, and again work quite broadly across topics in mathematical cognition. I'm currently associate editor for Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology, and have previously edited a bit for JNC and Developmental Science, but looking forward to hearing the conversations today. Colleen, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Colleen Ganley. I'm an associate professor at Florida State University. I mainly, at the moment, I'm studying math anxiety and other attitudes and how they relate to math. In terms of editorial stuff, I don't remember what they're called at JNC, Andre, like a action editor or something at Journal of Numerical Cognition. And I've been on the editorial boards for Journal of Educational Psychology and Contemporary Educational Psychology. So yeah, and also reviewed widely, no neuroscience for me, but education and psychology.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Andre Knops. I'm working at the CNRS, and I'm affiliated to the University of Paris-Cité. I am working in this field also for like some 20 years now. And I am currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of Numerical Cognition, for which I've been on the editorial board before. And apart from that, as you all said, I also have some experience as a reviewer in a variety of domains, experimental psychology, all the way to neuroscience and back to educational psychology.
Okay, thank you very much for introducing yourself. Now, I will start asking you some of the questions that people from the MCLS sent in the Google form. I would like this to be quite a conversation, quite smooth conversation, so feel free to unmute yourself and just speak when you want to speak. So I will start with this first question, which is quite general. And it is, imagine you went back in time to advise your younger self writing their first response letter to a reviewer. What would you do?
I want to go first. No, actually, that's quite funny. Not in hindsight, it's a funny story. But when I submitted my first article, I had gotten the reviews, and I had them like in my drawer for like 6 months, and didn't do anything until the point when the editors came back to me like, "Hey, what do you want to do? Do you still want to work on that or not?" And that's when I realized, oh, yes, right, there was something I had forgotten about. So that's the thing you should not do. That's my first advice. So if you receive that, work on it in time, hand it in the time frame that is given to you. Maybe that was also not my fault because there was no time frame given. But even if there's no time frame, but no deadline, do it swiftly, and that's good for everybody.
I have my kind of first couple of things I thought of. So the first thing, if you're responding to reviewer comments, you have already met a particular threshold. I feel like for me, the first time I got a revise and resubmit, or oftentimes it's a reject and resubmit, and the distinction is not clear. But like where you're like, you see that word reject and you're like, oh my God, they hated it. But if they're inviting you to resubmit it, like you have passed a bar already. So start with the interpretation of like, these people are trying to help you make your paper better, not that like these people hate your paper. That framing for me is really helpful instead of being like, oh, like I failed. And then you're going to read all these comments and most of them will be negative because you don't need to improve the things that are good. It doesn't mean they didn't like anything about your paper. But like, yes, at the beginning, they'll be like, these are good things, maybe in a sentence or two. And then they're like, here's a list of 20 things that you should change. So, but that perspective of like, if they spent the time to actually do this, they probably like, they think there's some value to your work if you're getting even asked to resubmit the paper. So I think that framing has always helped me and helped me not delay. Like oftentimes the initial failure response is that avoidance or delay. And so to me, that's kind of helped me kind of mentally frame that a little bit. And the other thing I will say too, that I struggled with kind of related to that is like being really defensive earlier in my career. I still am that way. And I allow myself to feel that and be like, no, everything you've said is wrong. My paper was like really perfect, actually. And I don't want to work on it anymore because I actually just spent 2 years working on it. So like, thanks, but no. And so I think you have to, my postdoc mentor did this, like we allowed ourselves to write like our snarky version before editing it back out to be not a snarky. So like allow yourself to be a little bit like, that makes absolutely no sense. And then you're like, okay, back it up. Like, thank you so much for your close read of the, like it's okay to let yourself be kind of like a little angry and defensive, but then you just got to move on from it. Because at the end of the day, your paper will be better after you do things the reviewers suggested. I don't think I've ever had a case where I didn't think my paper was better afterwards. And this relates to some later questions of like, that doesn't mean I did everything they asked for, but like typically your paper is going to get better from this process. And these people are just other people in our field. It's not like they don't want your paper to get published. It's the perspective can feel really like distancing, but like they're just other people doing research in your area. It's not like they want you to do badly or whatever. But those are my first things I think of, mostly about this like framing of how I approach it, more so than like the technical, what you actually do.
I think one thing that I would say to myself, and like a very practical thing, is that my perspective of what a good review is and what a bad review is has changed so much. So as Colleen was saying, there's a lot of negativity in that. But when you haven't read many reviewers' comments, it just can feel overwhelmingly negative. So actually, if you get, when you start getting reviewers' comments, actually just ask someone else to read them and to give you a bit, because they will see the positivity more than you will only see the negative points. And until you've read enough to get a sense of what actually is a good review and what isn't a not so good review, it's helpful to get perspectives of somebody else on it. Because I think two people can read the same set of comments and just come away completely differently about, oh, wow, that was really good. And yeah, they picked out all these things, but oh, those are tiny fixable things. This is really positive. You should be really happy. And it's hard to see that, I think, for yourself. And then the other thing is just like take the emotion out, read it, put it in a drawer, don't think about it, don't mull over it, and then come back to it a few days later, because everybody just, you know, just feels the negative emotion to start with. And then you can come back and be much more rational over it.
Yeah, most of my responses have been given. I would summarize it by saying, don't panic. Like, this is what is happening, and this back and forth discussion, arguing about findings, interpretations, etc., it's part of science. So it's an inherent that other people will give you feedback that will be likely to be perceived negative, but in most cases, in all papers I've edited and I've written myself, it will improve what you did. So I would say don't panic, and don't wait to get on it, because the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to see the positive side of it.
I just want to add like two things. That first of all, Colleen, I really liked what you said about how to interpret what has been said by the reviewers, because that's important. They can only focus on the negative things that they think you should improve. They will not spend a lot of time on the positive things. So that's very important to keep in mind. But also one thing that I would like to add is I had to learn how to translate some comments into action. For example, if somebody asks you like, look here, you interpret your data in terms of that strategy, but couldn't there also be an alternative strategy, X, Y, Z? And that actually means that you should go back to your data and try to reanalyze the data to see if that alternative interpretation makes sense and provide the results of that analysis. Sometimes only in your review, sometimes you can also include it in the paper. And that makes it stronger because you can eliminate like alternative interpretations. And that's something that I had to learn to translate this comment into some action. Okay, I can do an analysis to show that the review was right or wrong. And that's also something that helps you to get the work done. And the last thing that I would like to add is it's an incremental process, and you shouldn't think that you can have it done in an afternoon. It's going to take time, days, weeks sometimes. And if you work on it and you go back and forth to the job, then eventually it's getting done. But don't be like, okay, I will do this in a day or two. Usually it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and related to that, be aware that any published paper has likely gone through that procedure. That, I mean, you don't see that, but it's likely behind most of the stuff that is published.
Okay, great. I forgot to mention for the participants in the meeting, I will open the floor for questions later, but if you have follow-up questions, or you feel free to raise your hands or write the comment and I can read your question. So I will go on to the second question, which is, do editors have preferences for the actual layout of the response document, for instance, using different colors, bolded text for reviewers' comments versus author responses?
I can start off with this one. I think one thing that I, as an editor, is if it looks like you've summarized the reviewer's points and then responded to them, rather than cutting and pasting from the review, I'm always a little bit suspicious if the authors have actually skipped the bits that they don't want to respond to. And then I've got this extra bit of work that I've got to go back to the reviewer's original review and make sure that actually they haven't just skipped out. So I'm a big fan of just cut and paste the entire of the reviewer's response, put it in another document, and then add your responses in between. And then as an editor, I'm totally happy that you're being honest and open about responding to everything. And I would also, just picking up on Andre's point earlier, you know, this is a communication, right? You can put a whole load of stuff into your response letter that isn't changes that you make to the manuscript. So don't just think it in terms of like, oh, we've dealt with this comment and then the summary, you know, the paragraph from the paper or whatever. Actually engage in a dialogue and a conversation and explain. And then it's much easier if you don't want to do something, but you know, you're providing all that evidence. But actually, you know, it is a conversation between the reviewer, the author, and the editor kind of all together, and treat it like that. So you can have an incredibly, ridiculously like 20-page long response letter and actually make very small amounts of changes to the manuscript. But you've put into the response letter all of your rationale and explanation, potentially more analysis and that kind of thing. It doesn't all have to go into the revised version of the manuscript as well. That didn't really answer some of the questions, sorry. I'll let Bert do it.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what Camilla has said. Like, as an editor, I really prefer the point-by-point response, and numbering the points is really of a great help. And what you can also do is, if not all reviewers do that, but try to identify things and then list those different points, copy paste what reviewers said and what your response is to that. As an editor, for me, the most important thing to read is the response letter. And actually, I think most reviewers, when they receive a revision, will do that as well. So what I always advise to my students is like, make your response letter as good as possible. And often this results in the response letter that is longer than the manuscript. Because like Andre and Camilla said, there can be additional analyses, there can be a complete line of reasoning and argumentation as to why you are doing something or you are not doing something, without implications of that for the manuscript. And so that should be reflected in the response letter. And in terms of the very practical things like layout, just make it clear that there is a difference between what the reviewer said and what you are saying. And whether it's italicized or colors or bold, I don't mind, as long as it's clear and systematic. Yeah.
I agree. I think the actual formatting is less important than it just being obvious what is what, like, no matter how you do it. But also as a, not on the editor side, but as a reviewer, when I get it back without my original reviews, I then go back and read what my review was. Then I have to search on my computer. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm annoyed. I've started out annoyed. And I know that's obviously, you know, whatever, but like, you don't want your reviewer to start out annoyed. That's all. Like, I don't remember what I said. Okay. I don't. Please tell me.
Yeah, it can be summarized to something I say in very different context, and which is like, make it your readers as easy as possible. People don't have time to do all what they want. So you have to make sure that they can see as quickly as possible anything you want to convey, whether it's for a paper or a review or a response or a grant application. Try to make it as clear as possible from the beginning.
Also, a very practical advice that I would have is that sometimes you include changes into your manuscript. And please tell the reviewer and the editor where to find that. Like, put in the page number of the revised version, not the original version, like of the revised version, or the line number, and that helps a lot. Because otherwise you would have to go and find it yourself, and that nobody wants to do that.
I had a similar thought, and I will say, like, if it's something short, like you changed a couple sentences, just paste that into the response. But if it's like you reworked the organization of a whole section, please don't paste that like 4-page. That's my own opinion. I think people disagree on this, but like, I don't want a new 4-page thing in there. Give me a page number and a place to look. But if it's like a couple sentences you added or a paragraph even, like, just paste that in the letter. Then I don't have to go find it. And I'm just like, yep, looks good, you know.
Good. Now we have a more specific question, which is how to rebut a suggestion that is incorrect and or beyond the scope of your work. So what to do when you don't agree or how to politely disagree.
Well, in my opinion, it's the easiest to be honest and front up and say, I don't agree for this and that reason. And then you explain why, and that's it. I mean, in a polite way, in a factual way, without what you said in the beginning, like all these like emotional reactions in the first place. You cut them out, of course, and you remain very factual, and you explain why this and that you don't think it's appropriate and correct, and explain. That's it.
But I do think you need to evidence that. So you can't get into a situation where the reviewer is saying, oh, I think this could be an alternative explanation. And you say, no, I don't think so. And then you have to do whatever work you need to do to convince the reviewer to change their mind. But I do think there's a real balance here. Okay, so it's about your name is on the paper. So you don't want to make any changes to the paper that you don't agree with and believe in, because at the end of the day, your name is on it, not the reviewer's name. But also, sometimes there are things that you're like, well, I'd probably rather not do it, but actually it's not really harming it. And I really don't want to do this point over here. So I'm going to do this one here, even though my initial instinct was not to do it. As long as it doesn't, change what I'm saying, in order to kind of, if you push back against every single point and you don't have good evidence to explain why, then that's where you're going to struggle. So it's kind of like work out which are the ones that I really feel strongly about, and I'm going to push back on those and provide evidence why. And some of the others maybe kind of let it go. And I guess the other thing to bear in mind is that actually it's a little different across different journals, but you're not actually trying to convince the reviewer, you're trying to convince the editor. So it's not that you've got to change the reviewer's mind, but you've got to show to the editor that your perspective adequately rebuts what the reviewer was saying. So kind of remember that it's a three-way conversation, not a two-way conversation.
Yeah, I want to elaborate a bit on that because, I mean, at least what I do as an editor, and I think many others, but not all do, is like we have of course, a careful reading of the reviews and the paper, and we kind of highlight the things that we think are the most critical to address. And of course, yeah, it's important to really keep those highlights in mind, because an editor can also feel when going through the reviews that some issues are more important than other issues. And so that might be stressed or highlighted in the in the comments of the editor. So keep that in mind when performing the review. Also, typically there's different reviewers pointing to issues related to your paper. If it's a point that it's repeatedly coming back, that is of course something that gets much more weight. Like if to give a very concrete example, if 3 reviewers indicate that you have to do X, yeah, then you need to have really good arguments to say I'm not going to do that. Which is unlikely to be the case if 3 people are pointing to that similar critique. So that these are things that you have to keep in mind. Like what if one reviewer is saying something and the editor doesn't really talk about in the comments that are provided to the paper, and if you have good arguments, because the basics is always you need to have a good argument, either theoretically or empirically with data that you kind of use to support your claim. Yeah, if it's only one comment that is not further discussed, it's of course a different story as compared to something that is coming repeatedly up and that is stressed by the editor.
Yeah, I think, and y'all are giving good time, like how to figure out which things are really important to do and which aren't can be hard. So that's where like co-authors, other people looking at it can help you with this. But yes, if the editor mentions it, typically it's something higher. And sometimes the editor doesn't actually agree with some of the reviewer comments too. So not only is it this, but like sometimes I'm like, No, that's actually, I think the analysis is right. You know, like, it's like, because some things are opinions, or some people have different types of knowledge, right? So when I'm a reviewer, if I'm reading a paper with an analysis I don't know a lot about, I'll often say that, just to be clear that it's like, I actually don't know this analysis well, so my advice could be off. Because sometimes that's like, sometimes people don't know your analysis well when they're reviewing your paper. Like, reviewers are typically, you know, in field, but they don't necessarily know like your exact type of work, the exact analysis. Like, it's unlikely they're also experts in all of the exact same things we're doing. So, and same with the editor as well, even more so. They might be even farther afield depending on the journal. So, the other thing related to what Camilla said was like, you kind of have to pick and choose. Like, the only time which I felt so awful that I rejected, or as a reviewer said to reject after a resubmission, and the paper was rejected after resubmission, meaning I got a response letter with all the comments, and they basically rebutted everything I suggested. And like, I'm not going to accept your paper if you do that. Like, and that sounds so, but it's just like, you didn't actually change anything. Why are we doing this process? Even small things. And so that's why I think Camilla's like, it's like, figure out what the big things are that are like non-negotiable, that you need to change. And also, like, if there's a couple things you want to say no to, then say yes to all the easy stuff. Don't argue over, like, one thing it was like they were using the word effect instead of relation for, like, you know, a non-experimental design. And I'm like, it would probably be, you know, to remove causal language when you're talking about your results themselves. And they were like, it was a mediation model. So they were like, indirect effects is what people say, but I'm like, that's fine when you're talking about the model, but then in the result, or in the discussion, you got to drop the word, you know, and they didn't do it. Like, stuff like that, where it's just like, I'm literally asking you to change like 6 words in your document. You know, it's a very choose your battles kind of scenario. And so I think overall you want to respond and do what they ask as much as possible that's to you reasonable for your paper. And then really say no to the things that you feel are either, sometimes they're, you know, an analysis suggestion is incorrect, but sometimes, like, a theoretical thing, like, you could just add a sentence or two to the paper that at least addresses their point. Like, you're not changing your argument, but you're at least addressing that there are alternative explanations, right? Like, so you're still addressing it even though you're not agreeing with the person necessarily. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay.
Here's a question for my colleagues. Like, sometimes, and I'm not sure about how to proceed with that. That's why I'm asking it. There's also the possibility to add a comment to the editor without posting it to the reviewer. For example, to explain to the editor, like, look, I really feel like this reviewer hasn't really understood the paper, so that's why I dealt this in that way with his responses, his corrections. How do you feel about that?
But do you want?
I've seen it rarely that there is a specific response from the authors that are not in the document that is circulated. And to me, it's again hinges all on argumentation and rationale. If they have good reasons to do that, and if that seems logic and plausible to me, then yeah, I'd be sensitive to that. And I definitely have taken decisions where authors did not follow a particular request of the reviewers, even though that reviewer then indicated that the manuscript had to be rejected. It can happen. I mean, one has to keep in mind that the reviewer can make errors, and that the reviewer is also only one person and like one take on a particular problem. I mean, I'm not going to give concrete examples because it might reveal identities, so I'm not going to do that, but some people can have very strong opinions about certain ways of addressing stuff. To give a very blunt example, like some people say you can only do experiments. Everything with correlations is bollocks, to say it bluntly. If you have that kind of strong opinions, yeah, as an editor, you try to put it into perspective, because these are like, yeah, very broad arguments which you can kill everything. And that's not the purpose of a review.
Another thing to kind of pick up on Andre's point is you can have a communication with the editor. So if your reviews come back and one reviewer, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we get into lots and lots of email communication, but let's say if you've got 2 reviewers who are suggesting completely opposite things that you do, then actually you can go back and ask the editor, do you have a strong feeling of which of these or whatever, rather than doing the whole revision and waiting to see. Or if a reviewer suggests something that's kind of sounds like it could be a deal breaker, like add another experiment or something like that, you can have that conversation before you just decide whether to revise or not, because it might, if the editor also thinks this is a deal breaker and you can't for whatever reason, then it might be worth just knowing that straight away before you do all the work. So, there is a little more room for like communication than I think perhaps sometimes people realize.
Yeah, and that even happens before the review start, because I guess you all have had the experience where you come up to a journal and they ask you to indicate people that you would like not to review the paper. And there could be good reasons for that. So it even happens before the editorial process is starting. And I do take those issues into account when selecting the reviewers for a particular paper, on the important condition that, again, like the reason for excluding a person needs to be clear. Not just I'm excluding this person because I may not like this person. No, if there needs again to be a rationale or an argument as to why that person cannot, in your opinion, give a good review of your work. And there could be reasons for that.
I think if we're talking about that, one other thing to bring up is like, please do make suggestions for reviewers, right? It's amazing how many people don't, and it is really hard to find reviewers. But also, if you make suggestions, there are some, very well-established senior people in the field who will get hundreds of review requests. If all your suggestions are people of that level, it's really unlikely that any of them are going to say yes. So put in some suggestions of people who are postdoc level or who have the expertise, and that, your editor will love you if you do that. So please do.
Absolutely.
So the next question is quite linked to what Camilla said earlier. So it's how to handle a comment you don't fully understand. So would you suggest to email the editor saying, I'm not sure I understood the comment, and maybe...
I think probably for that, I wouldn't, if they're like smaller points, I wouldn't email over each one, because that's kind of not, that will draw the process out and the editor might not manage it. But it's totally fine to say in your response letter. So I think what I would do as an author is to say, I don't think I've understood, I'm not sure what the reviewer means by this. I have interpreted it to mean this, and that's how I'm responding to it. If I've misunderstood, please could you let me know and I'll respond to it. So don't just say, I don't understand this comment and walk away. Try and respond to it, but explain how you have interpreted it. And it's, it's entirely possible that reviewers have said stuff that's unclear or confusing. So it's not that it's not a failure on your part to understand. It's absolutely possible that it's not clear.
Yeah, this is another case where like asking your co-authors to take a look at it, or just some random person where you're like, here's what the paper is, here's the page they said, like, can someone else try to help me piece this together? Because I just had this happen recently where we figured it out, but it did take a while because they were to figure out exactly what thing they were talking about, but yeah, I think the more you can try to problem solve it, and then I would do exactly as Camilla suggests, like just as politely as possible, not to be like, this wasn't clear, But like, I'm not 100% sure I'm, interpreting this correctly, but here's what I'm thinking. I think that vibe, most reviewers get it. And if it was a point that they really thought was important, they'll bring it up again, and then you have more information, but they're not going to be like mad about that as reviewer or editor. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll fully echo that. It's like part of the conversation. If you're talking to somebody and you say, I think I interpreted it that way, but I am not sure, then people will be responsive again to you. And that's the same in the review. Like, I wouldn't email the editors. I haven't seen that happening, but I have seen it multiple times that authors make an interpretation and respond in that way, and then the reviewer said like, okay, this is what I intended to say, or they say, no, I intended to say something else, but then it's again part of the review, and that won't be a basis to reject the paper. I would be very surprised if that specific element would be the reason for rejection. I would definitely doubt that.
There may be also be, I'm not sure like how to interpret the question, but maybe the question is also intending something like, okay, the reviewer is asking me to do something I don't know how to do, like an analysis that I don't understand. And that's a bit more tricky because sometimes you just end up like, okay, that's out of my scope. And I would say, okay, if you cannot do it, say it. Just be front up. Okay, I think the reviewer wants me to do X, Y, Z. I don't know how to do it. I can't. If it's not like, something that could easily be Googled in 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm like, one of the things I also want to read it, I think it has been said before, but I assume that you are never alone as an author on a paper. So ask your co-authors, ask your mentor, ask your supervisors. And in terms of the point that Andre was raising, like if they would, for example, propose an analysis that you do not know or understand, reach out to others to figure out, what does this mean? Can I do this? Does it make sense? If it's about statistics, reach out to somebody in your faculty, in your university that is an expert in statistics, and ask like, can you give me some advice on this? Because there is a difference between a reviewer giving a comment that is difficult to understand or not knowing what the reviewer intends to say, versus the reviewer suggesting you something that you do not know. And in the second case, you have to explore what it is before you would respond like, I'm not going to do this, or I find it difficult to do, or maybe that's not appropriate with the data I have, etc., etc. So yeah, if it's on that's probably particularly analyses that you don't understand, try to explore first what it means before you respond.
Great, thanks. I have another question, which is, if a reviewer suggests including a couple of papers, maybe theirs, that do not really need to be included, at least in the author's opinion, what is a polite way to decline this suggestion?
I mean, I think this is one of these points where it comes down to, is it going to harm the paper to put them in, right? I mean, none of us like to put in stuff that we don't think is exactly relevant, but, decide whether, you can obviously say that I don't see, if you really feel strongly, say, could the reviewer explain why they think this is relevant? But I feel that's just put it in, Everyone's read a paper where there's suddenly a weird paragraph in the discussion that doesn't seem to connect with the rest of it, and that's the paragraph that the reviewer wanted you to put in. It happens. Save the goodwill to say no to the stuff that's more important than putting a reference in.
I agree with what you say, Camilla. And also, you have to put yourself into the shoes of the reviewer who is doing the work for free. Like he's spending his time that he could use to write up his own research on your research. So that's like the small, tiny piece of bit that he could get from doing that work. You know, like that's part of it, I think. If it doesn't harm the paper, if it's not completely meaningless.
I will say too, I often suggest papers to be included. They're not usually mine. I mean, sometimes they're mine, but a lot of times they're like, you might guess I'm actually somebody else based on, because I'm like, Erin Maloney's work on this is great. Like, that's not me, but like, she's got great. So I know like oftentimes you're like, oh, this person's wanting me to cite them, but that's not always true, because sometimes it's just like, oh, I know this work well, and I know that this, would be a good fit. But yeah, I'm like, as long as I can tie it in some way, I'm just adding that paper so I can check off that comment. I mean, having an argument with a reviewer over this, I would say, is typically not worth it. Like, it's like, this is not a conversation. Just add it in a way that's remotely accurate and as little as you can do to add it in.
Yeah, and if it's really off topic, or if it's really harming what you want to say, then just say so. But I mean, again, it's about good argumentation. Like, I mean, you cannot, I mean, we are at the point in the literature where we cannot include all stuff anymore. So yeah, sometimes you make a selection and then maybe the reviewer feels like, hey, but I'm also working on that topic, and I feel I also need to be represented here. Yeah, I mean, that's an easy win. But of course, if the reviewer is suggesting a paper to make a point that you don't want to make, or if that paper is really not about the things you are discussing, yeah, then you can of course say so.
Maybe we can open the floor now to the other participants. Are there any questions, comments? You can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask directly.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks so far. This was super helpful. So when I write the response letter, who will see it in the end? Because I'm wondering whether the reviewers will see the responses to the other reviewers, because sometimes you keep repeating yourself. If there is reviewers who have the same comments, that probably means that there's something true about it and you should change something. But do I have to repeat it for everyone and also for the editor? I mean, the editor sees everything, but yeah, do the reviewers see the reply to the editor as well?
So the reviewers different. Oh, go.
Oh no, go ahead, Camilla.
Yeah, so the reviewers will see the response to the other reviewers. So you can certainly do the thing of, and especially if you've labeled up the points really nicely and clearly, you could say, please see the response to reviewer 1.3 or whatever above. I think there is sometimes with journals, there's the scope to say something separately to the editor that the reviewers might not see. But I guess the other reason why it's really helpful, and you can think about that fact that reviewers are seeing the other comments, is actually if two reviewers have said like opposite points, and then you can kind of politely and nicely say, well, thank you for this comment. We've just chosen not to do this because reviewer 2 suggested blah, 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 or whatever. So yes, they will see the comments to other people.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that is very customary, and like Camilla said, and this often happens, like one reviewer proposes one thing and then another proposes the opposite, which is a nice situation for you, because you can really decide what you want to do, and then you use one versus the other, and to say that explicitly okay, I decided this because this reviewer is suggesting that, and therefore I don't do what you are suggesting. I typically don't mind if people in responses to reviews reiterate points that they have already made, because I think, I mean, this is speculative. I'm not sure whether it really happens, but I think sometimes reviewers look at the responses to their own comment, and just to make sure that like you have responded to theirs, it's not, I mean, it's not too hard to repeat things you have already said, because if they have a list of comments and they only look at their part and they see C point this, C point that, yeah, that gets a bit annoying, because then they have to flip around and stuff like that. So, I mean, just repeat it a couple of times and you can condense it, but I mean, just indicate that, okay, I have responded to that, you can find more information in that point. Something like that. And in terms of confidential comments to the editor, it is a possibility. I have rarely seen it used.
I'll just add, and this is more as a reviewer perspective, like I do read the other reviews and the responses to those. And sometimes I'm like, oh, they made a really good point that I missed. And maybe the authors were like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And then I'm kind of like, no, I also kind of think you should do that. So like, it is kind of a tough spot sometimes where it's like, oh man, like we were hoping, and it's like, oh no, they're right. Like I missed it, but they're right. But I will say this is a kind of separate point, but once you start reviewing, depending on career stage, some of you, already have, but reading other people's reviews is very helpful to kind of understand, because it's like a weird part of our, service that isn't really trained in any specific way. And so, I mean, you should seek out experiences for other training as well, but I find it incredibly helpful to read the reviews that other people write, and have learned a lot from reading them as well for my own writing and for my students and stuff. So that's one thing I think Bert's right. Some reviewers probably just are like, boo, they did my stuff, whatever. But I do think a lot of reviewers will read your responses to all of the reviewers. So.
Yeah, I just want to align with that, Colleen, that this is, I mean, one of the most interesting experience I had personally as a researcher from doing the reviewing work and also the editorial work, like having learned a lot from what other people comment and write, and how other people respond to those issues and things like that. So, I mean, this is probably not when you're in making the PhD, but definitely when you're early career. Of course, you should find a balance, but I think it's a really interesting exercise for you as a researcher to do review, to look at the reviews. They are typically sent then when other people have looked at the same paper that you have reviewed. It's really an opportunity to learn something.
And I want to add something, because I think it's very important that you do that work. We as editors, we always struggle to find reviewers, right? So it's important you do that work. And sometimes you may wonder, like, how much would I have to do? How many papers do I have to review? And that's a difficult one, because you may get a lot of requests. And so a colleague of mine suggested a very easy formula that said, like, okay, I'm doing as many reviews as I caused. If I published 3 papers and each paper had like 2 reviewers, then it makes 6 reviews to do. And I think that's a fair amount of work that you should give back to the community without like putting too much in. So I found that very helpful.
Thanks, that all makes much sense and it's really helpful.
Are there any other questions you want to? Okay, I can ask one. What if they ask you to change something, for example, extra analysis, but you don't have, you do not longer have access to scoring of tasks? If they ask to score a different way, should you just be honest why you can't do it anymore?
I mean, yeah, I'm always like the more honest and transparent, and sometimes that's just the case, right? Someone handed you these data and that's what you have. And so, but I will say it is sometimes unfortunate when some things aren't super clear in the original submission. Sometimes a reviewer will ask for detail or information. And then when you provide it, they're like, that's bad, actually, but I didn't know it was bad because I didn't have the information before. So that's something to keep in mind that can be a risk sometimes of like having either multiple resubmissions after or rejection after even, is like sometimes your answer to their question is like a deal breaker, but they didn't know because they didn't have the information, if that makes sense. So if you're like, they ask about the scoring detail and you're like, here's how it was scored and I can't rescore it because I don't have access to it, like that might actually be a real problem for that reviewer. The editor's decision is whether, you know, that's such a big problem that they wouldn't publish the paper, but that is something to keep in mind when you run into that situation. It is a risk, but like if you don't have it, you don't have it. So you just gotta say it. Yeah. I will add, actually, even for like a meta-analysis, we were asked to like get more recent papers into it. And I was like, we're not doing that. Or it was my student's paper. And I was like, we're telling them, like, because my student was like, should we do the whole, it's like, no, we have to do a whole search. Like, so we literally explained, like, you're asking us to do like an additional 6 months of work to add like 10 papers to this meta-analysis, and we're not going to do it. It's a reasonable request. So, you know, but we were just like, even though like, yes, technically we could do it, we're not going to.
Great. So I will ask you the last question, which is quite general. And it is, are there any unexpected benefits or skills you've gained from reading response letters? And just the second part of the question, what are the most memorable response letters you've read?
I'm quickly responding to the first point. Like, I think it's a very useful exercise to see how people comment on others' research. So I would recommend this to do to all people who have their PhD or going towards the end of the PhD as a useful exercise. It's really beneficial for your career, for your own writing, for your own projects, etc. And I leave the memorable to to the others while I keep thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Bert that it's really valuable, both reviewing and editing, and you know, getting to read stuff that I might not choose to read, learning about areas of research that are a little bit aside, and then suddenly you like learn that, oh, there's all this interesting stuff out here that hasn't been brought into our field yet and totally could be. So it's really valuable from that point of view. I don't have a particular like memorable response letter. I would say that I think there are some like international sort of, we have different cultural styles to communication. And with a British perspective, sometimes the letters that are so like, oh, we thank the reviewer for this incredibly helpful comment, that comes again and again, to a British person starts to sound sarcastic. Like, you're just taking the piss now. So I think, you know, a little bit of perhaps checking how your language lands, particularly for international journals and international reviewers and editors, might be worth doing.
Just like calling out Americans like that, just like, or Canadians too, probably. But I tell my students, it's like, you don't have to say that to every you know, like your overall tone is more important than actually like saying thank you, if that makes sense. But that does crack me up. I will say, from, I think, as an editor, and even from all angles, there are differences in tone, both culturally and between individuals. And so it can be difficult to pull, like, sometimes a review is actually like incredibly positive, but like doesn't feel like it. And sometimes the review is pretty negative, but the person is like trying to couch it really nicely. And so you kind of have to dig a little bit sometimes to get a sense of like, of that. But so I think I've learned a lot about that from reading reviews and from reading people's responses, I think, too. And then what I actually think is the most interesting is like the reviewer's response to the response, because that helps you learn like what are the sticking points for a lot of people, or what are the things people are just like, you explained it, I'm good, that's enough for me. Because I definitely learned a lot about what people are like not willing to, you know, like not satisfied with certain responses on, whereas things where like for the most part, like people are just like, you didn't take my suggestion, but like that's okay. And that's helpful in the future too, for like thinking about your own writing as well. I don't have a great story, but I did get a review that was really mean once when I was in graduate school. And for the only time this has ever happened, but so when a reviewer submits the review, they can't see any of the other reviews until after they submit theirs. So like, you don't know what anyone else said when you review, but when you get the response to reviews, right, you see what the other person said, like we talked about. And so in the response after that, the second reviewer was like, the first reviewer's review was really mean. And I've never seen something like that, but I like so appreciated this random person like sticking up for me. But that was that's the only time that's ever happened. But I just like really appreciated that. So, and I think editors, this is part of our responsibility when we're editing too, is like to try to police tone a little bit in these ways to make sure, especially sometimes when I'm reviewing, I have to remind myself, like, this could be the first paper this person has ever submitted, and they are like a third-year graduate student, right? But it's hard to keep that perspective when you're just like, oh, here's one more task I got to get done today. So, you know, anyways, yeah, it's fascinating to read the things other people care about when they review papers.
One thing that I learned from that process is that which is sometimes not clear when you write your first papers, but actually what you want to read as a reader and as a reviewer as well is a story, right? You want to see like, okay, what is the question that you're trying to ask and what's the response? And sometimes you may get lost in like the literature, and it goes back to the 50s and the 60s of the last century, and you've read all of these papers and you want to show that you mastered the literature, and you put it all into the introduction, which becomes like too much. Nobody can ever read and digest that. And that's what I think I also took away from this reviewing and being an editor, that you want to have a coherent story. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you write the introduction of your paper, that you have a story to tell. I think that's also a bit of a cultural thing. It's more common to have this storytelling for the US Americans than for the Europeans, I think. So it may be a little bit of a cultural difference, but that's what I learned, is it's much easier to follow a paper when it's a good story.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, so I want to thank you again for accepting this invitation and to be part of this panel. I think it was a great and useful discussion. Ilse or Brianna, do we have any announcement to make for the next special or something, or are we okay?
Good question. For the next special